Welcome to Flex Perspectives, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 4,500 companies, 30,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Dror Poleg. In 2019, Dror wrote an award-winning book titled Rethinking Real Estate, where he predicted many of the changes we've experienced with hybrid and remote work. He is regularly featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other major publications. Today, we'll discuss how he was able to foresee the current state of work even before the pandemic. We'll talk about where Dror sees the biggest risks in real estate, how careers will change with the rise of remote work, and where he sees the world going over the next several years. Dror, welcome.
Hi, Rob. Great to be here.
Thank you for coming. So you've been writing and speaking about the future of work for a long time now. What made you so interested in this topic to begin with?
So I'm interested in it from a few different angles. I spent more than a decade in private equity real estate, so buying sites, developing them. And I did that in China from 2005 to 2015 predominantly. So I was in an environment that was very dynamic, where people's habits were changing, where technology was very much integrated with kind of the perception of location, with, particularly with mobile payments and location-based services that are much more advanced there. So that drove me to kind of think about the broader relationship between real estate and technology and how it affects how people use space. But maybe more personally, I'm a bit of a neurotic Jew. So a child of refugees who were themselves children of refugees who constantly had their lives upended in various ways. So I'm constantly looking back to try to understand what's about to come back and hit me. And as I look ahead at my career, I realized that, there's plenty of potential anxiety there. So I mostly, out of selfish reasons, constantly try to figure out, okay, what's going to happen next? Where can I find certainty? And assuming that I cannot find it, how do I stay on top of it and kind of know what's coming? And first for myself, but then at some point I realized that it's valuable to share that with other people and that they find it valuable. So I've been focusing on that for the last almost decade.
Got it. It's a good sense of self-preservation you have in that way. So one of the interesting things, you refer to yourself in that regard as an economic historian. So for folks that may be less familiar with that title or topic, what does that mean exactly?
So economic history is an academic field, something between economics and history. And it focuses mostly on kind of the history of economic phenomenon. So from big questions like why did the Industrial Revolution start in England and not in Shanghai, to questions that are more micro about why do some industries have two big players and other industries have more reasonably distributed, 20 competitors. So basically the long-term interaction between technology and economic phenomena.
Got it. And one of the areas that I know you've studied and talked about quite a bit that I find fascinating is the history and linkage between real estate and economic output. And so if I think way back, in the beginning, these things were inextricably linked, right? But tell me a little bit about that and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah, so in the real beginning, obviously the output you got out of your land as a farmer was very much tied to how much land you had and where that land was located. But even as recently as, 5 years ago, and actually even today, if you open a real estate kind of economics textbook or real estate investment textbook, they have a few kind of common formulas that kind of say, okay, this is GDP growth, this is job growth, this is population growth, some magic formula, and then that equals demand for office or that equals demand for housing. But what we started to see it earlier, but what most people are starting to realize now is that relationship, that kind of linear relationship between economic growth, GDP growth, job growth, and actual demand for space in general and for office in particular is frayed or at least becoming much more complex than assumed.
And where did that start? Was there a particular moment that you would point to, whether in the evolution of work from factories to something else, or when did you really start to see some deviation in that regard between those two, those two pieces?
I think, it depends how far you want to go on this point as well. Already in the last 50, 60 years, we started to see at least some work become much more distributed. But that was mostly offices moving to the suburbs. And even before that, kind of factories being kind of split into two or three, where the office was suddenly in one place and the factory was another, just thanks to telephones and then cars. But getting closer to our days, it looks like from the data that at some point around 2015, something happened. Until then, there was kind of an assumption that even in the age of the internet, actually work is becoming more concentrated because companies are doing more creative, more innovative stuff. They have to kind of be more together than the companies of the past. And because they hire creative people, they have to go to those handful of cities where creative people live. But around 2015, 2016, we both started to see that even though the economy was still growing, New York City, San Francisco, London, Paris were actually losing population. So people were moving out of them for some reason or for various reasons. But also from the companies themselves, we started to see them split their headquarters into 2, 3, 4, 5. Amazon, most notably with HQ2 and kind of HQ3, and Stripe, which even before COVID opened a remote hub. And Stripe's CTO said explicitly, we're opening this hub to hire the 99.7% of talent that doesn't live in San Francisco or Singapore or New York or London. So we started to see a change in preference where corporations were more interested in hiring from a bigger pool of talent than in necessarily prioritizing in-person work, a preference that may have been there even 20 years ago, but suddenly something made it possible for them to actually act on it. So maybe remote collaboration became better, maybe talent shortages became acute enough, but something kind of broke. And as we headed into COVID, even before COVID, it was kind of clear that this trend will only intensify.
Got it. So if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like maybe a couple things. There was maybe starting to hit diminishing returns in talent locally, and as a result, hiring in other places, potentially salary differences, and being able to do that was meaningful enough that it started to become attractive. That and the kind of improvement in technology through the 2010s. You think those are the couple of things that really started to drive that behavioral change?
Yeah, but more of the need to access a bigger talent pool. Rather, I think price was less of an issue. I mean, when you have an office in San Francisco and you open one in New York or London, you're not necessarily going to save money on the type of people that you're going to hire. But there is the issue of matching talent. And as the economy becomes more specialized, you kind of get a higher and higher return at matching exactly the right person to exactly the right task. And to do that well, the bigger your talent pool, the more likely you are to actually make that match that might invent the next Instagram or the next Gmail or the next kind of product that a single person at the right company at the right time tends to invent. And that matching phenomenon was one of the key drivers of companies and employers into cities to begin with, because they thought, okay, I need to hire from the largest possible talent pool, so I'll go to New York City or the Bay Area and not to any other large city, even if those cities have 2 or 3 or 5 million people. But at some point, they kind of realized, hey, why hire from a pool of 10 million if I can hire from a pool of 50 million? There's a trade-off here in terms of the in-person work that I can facilitate, but they started basically voting with our feet and showing us that there's kind of a new preference that is starting to take precedence.
Got it. So it sounds like this was already kind of more rapidly untethering, if you will, the linkage between real estate and economic output through the 2010s, 2015, 2016. It sounded like it's really started to move. So tell me what happened in 2020 when the pandemic hit. How did that impact that trend?
So the world turned on its head, because suddenly, if before it was kind of a gradually revealed preference that people barely even understood that they're making that trade-off, they just kind of like in the spur of the moment kind of had to open another office and maybe didn't really think about it strategically. Now all the basic assumptions are the opposite. So instead of having everyone at the office and trying to convince yourself why you should give them more flexibility or why you should have another office somewhere else, suddenly nobody's at the office. Your employees are spread all over the world. If you're growing, you're starting to hire people also in all sorts of even new places. If you're fundraising, you're suddenly realizing that you can fundraise not necessarily by going to the local coffee shop in Palo Alto. And then as the pandemic recedes, now you have to convince yourself why you should go back to normal. So for executives, it was a little easier for them to convince themselves. But for many of the employees, it wasn't easy anymore. I mean, they're like, oh, actually, this thing works for me. Plus, I've made all sorts of commitments and I have new path dependencies now in terms of where I moved to, in terms of how I spend time with my family, in terms of how I manage my time and what I prioritize in my life. and kind of like mixed everything up, and both in a way accelerated some kind of undercurrents that were there to begin with, but also really broke some stuff in a way that maybe is permanent.
Got it. I find it so fascinating that you published Rethinking Real Estate in, if I recall correctly, October 2019, right? So you were just months out in front of the pandemic, obviously reporting on something that you were already starting to notice for a number of years beforehand. As you look back on that 4 years ago now, which pieces did you get right in advance of the pandemic that maybe the pandemic accelerated, and which pieces actually played out a little bit differently than you would have expected back in 2019?
So one, this matter of remote work. So, I described some of the stuff that I just described to you, but already in 2019, kind of seeing those changes in preferences in companies and basically asking myself, do I see a limiting factor here? If companies can now work from 5 different locations, and these are not regular branches that are there to serve local customers. They're there to hire people and to conduct intensive creative R&D activity, the kind of stuff that economists told us that has to be done in one place and has to be done in the center of Manhattan or San Francisco. If companies are doing it and they can do it across 5 different places, why can't they do it across 10 different places or 50? What's going to limit them? Plus, if this need for hiring from a larger pool is really tied to innovation, that need is only going to intensify as more and more of the economy becomes creative, becomes service-based. So again, we're seeing this kind of like big thing pushing it. In addition, even before COVID, again, you started to see those large cities kind of losing population. You started to see the office market softening, which was a little hard to notice because we had Adam Newman and a few others signing leases and paying a lot of money for them. But they were signing leases for spaces that were either kept empty, so they were not really being leased by anyone, or that they were leased by WeWork, so they would come with a package of all sorts of things that made them more attractive. So basically, VC investors were subsidizing the office market and kind of propping it up, but you could see that the foundations are less and less stable. So that issue of the office market was in the book. My regret is that I didn't go even more aggressively in terms of describing what will happen, but I did kind of predict what ultimately happened. I saw the kind of blurring boundaries between housing and lodging, or housing and hospitality. So basically what we're seeing now with Airbnb, that they're focused less on people staying for a night or two, but more on people staying for a month or 2 months, like really something that makes it difficult for you to understand when someone is actually living somewhere or he's like staying somewhere. So that was an important boundary. I saw the potential trouble for cities. Some things that didn't unfold yet, I think the logistics sector, so warehouses, data centers, are under more risk than people assumed, and that's still true, particularly for e-commerce. We've seen some of that during COVID because e-commerce sales kind of shot up and then kind of ratcheted back down, fell pretty hard back to the ground to their previous trend. But so I think warehouses are still in for a few surprises that I kind of saw coming and didn't happen yet. But overall, yeah, the book, I mean, I would publish the same book today and probably it would do even better. It's a better time to launch this book.
That's probably as good a testament to what you did as you possibly could ask for, right? I find that point on warehouses and logistics really interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Like what are some of the factors that you're seeing come down the pike now that you think are creating a bit of risk or trepidation for those types of investments or properties going forward?
So first, we can talk about what warehouses aren't. The kind of the bogeyman, or like the victim, as I was writing the book in 2019, was retail real estate. Everyone talking about, okay, retail is finished, it's terrible. And I wrote in the book, retail is in big trouble. It has to kind of decrease in prices significantly. A lot of assets will be repurposed. But at the end of the day, a good retail property in the center of a city, street level, is inherently valuable, whatever you end up doing with it. If people sleep there or work there or sell stuff or park there, there's value to it. On the other hand, a lot of those sheds where we store stuff now, they fit into a very, very specific logistical paradigm that we're currently in. But in 5 years, in 10 years, if things start to fly, if things start to move around differently, if drivers need to make fewer stops because they're automated or because they drive different type of machines, suddenly you can have whole assets that are completely irrelevant and there's nothing else to do with them. Maybe you can build apartments on top of them or houses or something down the line, but they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, near a highway maybe, but not attractive to any other use. So that's one thing. But maybe more importantly, it's less about them becoming completely useless, but more about how they were valued. So a lot of those logistics assets, because investors were running away from retail and even from office a little bit before COVID, more and more investors kind of piled into industrial real estate because that was the last category that still looked like real estate. It was kind of like an empty box with tenants that sign long leases. And that's what investors like, no services, no millennials, no, just give me a box with a tenant and, let me collect the check. And that kind of stampede by investors meant that those assets were valued at, 20 times, 30, 25 times like their kind of cash flow per year, which again reflected basically no risk. They're like as safe as treasury bills. And I figured that they're not as safe as treasury bills and they still aren't.
Got it. So it sounds like, if I understand correctly, that it's based on how automation plays out and if that impacts the way we think about inventory and how we house goods, like it have material impact on supply and demand for warehouses in a way that could really impact pricing. Is that a fair description of what you're saying?
Yeah, better than mine.
That's super, super interesting. It's something I haven't heard as much about. It would be interesting to see kind of how that plays out over the coming years. I want to go back to one topic that you mentioned before that I thought was really interesting, which is the difference between executives and employees in comfort and returning to the office. Not only is there big implications for real estate broadly and the untethering of real estate from economic output, but it changes a lot about how we think about leadership and management. And I imagine the change, at least from everyone that I talk to, for executives and frontline leaders is a pretty big one, and shifting from work all the time in the office to only part of the time potentially being in the office. You spend a lot of time consulting with companies on topics related to this. What are you seeing and hearing from execs and managers around that transition, what it feels like to kind of like go through that?
So as we were all home during COVID, one thing that it revealed to us was that a lot of our jobs can be done remotely, right? That more of our jobs could be done remotely, many more than we thought. But it also revealed another thing, that many of our jobs maybe are completely unnecessary. And a lot of those jobs are those kind of mid-management type of jobs. People that manage other people, that supervise other people, that make sure that other people are working. And suddenly, as you move towards more remote work, you also move towards more output-based work and more asynchronous work. And generally, a higher variety of work styles where people or teams are judged by, what they actually produce and not by presenteeism, not by who's being cute to the boss at a meeting, not by who looks like they're trying really, really hard and staying late. And I think that's a big threat for a lot of executives and middle managers. In addition, generally, the instinct, when you're controlling something and it works a certain way, you just want it to go back to how it was. It's much harder to manage people remotely, and it's particularly hard if you haven't done that before and if that's not your expertise. So the first instinct is to exercise your authority to the extent that you still have any. So that's why, a year and a half ago, the kind of the talking points of corporate America were like, okay, everyone should be back at the office within 12 days or 3 months. Or, we saw Jamie Dimon and others kind of saying, oh, I expect everyone to be back at the office exactly where I left them, by September 2021. So yeah, there was a conflict there. And again, on the other hand, the employees, they didn't play ball, basically. They continued to insist, many of them, that, that they're going to stay where they are, or at least come for much fewer hours and fewer days than the bosses wanted them to.
So the point you made before a second ago about the impact on mid-level managers, I think is really interesting, especially in the context of, I think organizations or companies like Meta and a number of others have talked about how they want to flatten their organizations, get back to maybe the way that it was structured in earlier years of the company to speed up decision-making and things like that. Do you think that's symptomatic of the same thing in terms of noticing that work gets done differently, or that the role or importance of mid-level managers changes in some way in kind of this more hybridized or untethered environment?
Yeah, definitely. I do think there's also, some of those companies, they just grew headcount really, really quickly, both 2-3 years before COVID and then during COVID. So even as they shed tens of thousands of employees, that only takes them back to where they were, maybe in 2020 or 2019. That's one thing. Second, we're under a very different interest rate regime and under very different economic conditions. So that focused on like ongoing expansion and I'm as big as the number of employees that are under me, I think has changed quite significantly now. And it's more about, let's see how much profit you can generate with fewer costs, as business should be. And so that's a big driver there as well. It's a confluence of a few different factors.
That makes sense. Are managers and executives, are you finding, are they ready for this transition toward managing more based on outcomes or what gets produced versus presenteeism and kind of input of time spent in office?
No, they're not ready for it by and large. To be honest, even before COVID, most managers didn't really have a clear sense of what they're doing and what their employees are doing. If you ask the largest employers, even in the innovative kind of tech companies, how productive are their employees or how different things impact their productivity in terms of work arrangement, software, the main way to gauge that was actually to ask employees, to do surveys and ask people, oh, do you feel more productive when you're sitting like this or like that? And that was about it. Another factor that's important here is that we increasingly live in a nonlinear economy where the kind of input that you throw in tells you very little about the type of output that you can get out. And it's very clear, particularly in creative professions and in programming, where, you can have the same people doing the same thing. One person will create something that is worth 1,000 times more. Or even in terms of the amount of code or actually solving an error problem. One person might do it in 10 minutes and another team of 10 people might spend 2 weeks on it and not solve it. And not because necessarily one is smarter than the other. Maybe the next day, different people are going to solve something faster, but it's just much harder to predict and much harder to manage. So in a way, if I can use that word, a lot of managers were kind of LARPing a little bit, particularly for the last 20 years. They were kind of like, oh, I'm here, I'm doing it. Good stuff comes out on the other end. It must have something to do with me, but maybe it doesn't. And once you take them out of the loop forcefully, as COVID has done to us, suddenly like, oh, this thing is working without those people. Let's see how long we can maintain that. And indeed, in some organizations, it didn't work too well, but in many, it did work well. And I think Facebook is a great example of that. They both cut costs and, their profits and their business in general seems to be doing better than it did a year ago. Twitter is a more extreme version, but it's a circus, so we'll leave them aside. But Facebook is a real big, serious company that employs tens of thousands of people, and it's leading the way.
Sure. So I imagine, and you talk to a lot of different companies, companies are probably taking a number of different approaches to figure out how do we evolve talent or evolve our managers and leadership to be able to figure out how to be more productive as leaders or manage in this way. Any common trends that you're finding broadly in terms of, the companies that are doing well at this, what are they doing, or how the psychology of what it means to manage or lead needs to change in order to skate to where the puck is going, so to speak, in terms of being successful in this more flexible world?
I think there's no single kind of silver bullet correct approach anymore. If there ever was one, but there's definitely none now. I think different companies, different teams, different individuals are going to figure out different ways that work best for them. So the main news now is just that more of those ways are feasible and available for people to kind of find what works best for them. In terms of organization specifically, I think that there's a few strategies, but I'll name two. One is pushing more kind of power and agency to the periphery. So enabling, at least at the team level, teams to figure out what works best for them and when do they want to come back to the office and how many meetings they want to have, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to work well. And also it gives you an ability as a company to accommodate different types of people. They can be assigned or self-select into teams or departments that work best for them in terms of how they like to work and how they are most effective. On the other hand, I also see value in the exact opposite approach. If we go back to Twitter, of like Elon Musk saying, okay, everyone should work like this. This is how I work. This is what our organization stands for. I expect you to be at the office all day long, kill yourself over it. Fine. I think that at least having clarity over that is valuable as well, to kind of say, this is what works for our company at the stage that we're in. And if you want to work in an organization like that, it's very clear to you that this is what you're joining, and that's fine. I think the biggest problem is the in-between. One, a lot of managers are completely in denial about even what they're actually doing. So I spoke before about some of them forcing people back to the office 5 days a week, and some companies kind of settling on 2 or 3 days. But a somewhat comical phenomenon that I'm seeing is that a lot of companies basically tell employees, and they say that explicitly, we require you to be at the office 5 days a week, but we're not going to enforce it. So it's like, we have to say that you're here, but you do whatever you want. And that's, it's kind of pathetic. And also, it doesn't help you hire the right people who are going to thrive within your organization because nobody understands what you're even trying to do. So, yeah.
It sounds like in some ways the most important thing from what you're seeing the companies can do is just be clear and put a stake in the ground one way or the other. Employees may vote with their feet, right? Whether to stay at the company or whether to find something else or a different team that better fits their needs. But lack of a policy or lack of clearly communicating what you're going to do, it sounds like it's maybe the worst of all worlds in terms of corporate approaches.
Yeah, and also to do it respectfully and, to tie it into a broader kind of cultural and kind of bigger goal. So, I mean, Elon Musk, he kind of does it right at Twitter because he says, we're fixing the most important company and the most consequential product in the history of communications, and I need everyone to be here, and I'm going to sleep on the floor. Okay. On the other hand, you have the Jamie Dimons of the world. They just say, oh, no, you all go back to the office. I'm still going to do whatever I want. Clearly, we're not doing anything too consequential. We're bankers. But, just because I said so, you should do it. So that doesn't feel like a very compelling argument.
Yeah, totally. And it aligns with something that we had Brian Elliott on the podcast recently, the founder of Future Forum and SVP at Slack. And he's a big advocate for team level agreements, similar to what you described, just for the clarity, right? Pushing some of the decision toward the front lines, at least it's clear at the team level what you're going to do. But you're right. It sounds like even if you go the total opposite direction, you could potentially be successful with that if you have a team of people that buy into that's what we're going to do. But you have to be clear that that's the stance you're going to take.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting. So one of the things I also wanted to dig into based on what you're describing before is the career pathing, I imagine, for employees probably now looks a lot different, both in terms of where they work, but also what it means to go from individual contributor to manager to grow into an executive over time. Is that right? Are you seeing that change at all over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the career landscape or the career paths ahead of us are far less clear and far less structured than those that, our parents faced, but even those that, Gen Xers faced, 20, 30 years ago as they entered the workplace. They kind of saw some of these things coming, but they got away with 20 or 30 years of reasonable kind of employment, partly because they're a smaller generation, so there are enough jobs for them and enough houses for them. But yeah, as I look ahead at the career, what seems to be happening to me is that if in the past we could choose whether we want a very risky career, like, be a rock star or be an athlete or be someone that either becomes really, really successful or suffers constant anxiety and instability.
Basically,
now, yeah. So, Nassim Nicholas Taleb called it scalable and non-scalable occupations. Your parents told you to go into a non-scalable occupation, a doctor, an accountant, even an engineer used to be someone who's like very location dependent, where your competition is basically limited by geography. But now more and more professions are becoming scalable because suddenly almost whatever we do, we're suddenly competing with people all over the world who can do the same thing, and soon even with algorithms and robots that can do similar things. At the same time, we have the ability to service people all over the world, so the rewards are much bigger as well, both of, whether we work as a freelancer, but even as an employee, we work for companies that can scale our input much, much higher. They can generate much more revenue based on what we do, so they're going to pay us much more. Plus, we can match better, that matching idea again. We can match with employers that need our exact set of skills. So not just that I'm a Stanford engineer, etc., but that I have some very unique experience that some company is willing to pay 10 times more than another company for because they need my skills. But it also means that I'm now in a very dynamic environment and I have no idea what's going to replace me, who is going to compete me or try to undercut me. And maybe more importantly, an environment in which, unless you're a big winner, you're going to struggle. There's no more middle. Just kind of saying, okay, I'm going to choose a decent profession. And even if I'm not the best in the world, I'm still going to have a nice middle class or upper middle class living. That proposition is less and less tenable.
Does that mean that people will hop jobs significantly more often, you think, in the future, just given the greater access potentially to supply of different types of jobs or roles for companies that can be based anywhere in the world? Or does that reduce because if you have some level of specialization, you find the role that's right for you and you really stick with that particular company that is exactly doing or needs the thing that you can do? How do you think that evolves?
I think it'll be a model of some of these things happening at the same time. But I think on net, careers will be shorter than they were. I mean, people are going to switch even whole professions 2 or 3 or 4 times during their lives. Obviously, if you're in a stable, nice job, then keep it for as long as you can. Plus, there's going to be a lot of kind of shifting boundaries. Again, people with side hustles, people freelancing. And it happens, again, from the corporation's perspective as well. These days, as companies become bigger, they also depend more on outsourcing, on freelancers of various kinds, and not just for cleaning and security, but again, for creative work, for stuff that used to happen only within the organization. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I also think that we'll have to find all sorts of new ways to de-risk those type of lifestyles, both in terms of government policy, but also in terms of how people invest, how people kind of create pools with other people to kind of make sure that they're all covered, while some of them kind of fluctuate up and others fluctuate down. It'll be an interesting time.
And I imagine the implications also for dense urban environments, right? Versus kind of maybe more second tier cities or suburban rural environments now where you can work from more locations, or high tax regimes versus low tax regimes. There'll probably be pretty meaningful implications there as well.
Yeah, I mean, cities are currently grappling with a somewhat severe office crisis or commercial real estate crisis that has not played itself out yet. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because a lot of people are still pretending that it's not happening at all. But at some point, leases are coming up for renewal and they may not be renewed, and loans are coming up for renewal, and the lenders might either charge much more or kind of not be willing to lend to some office buildings at all. So we'll see some assets kind of completely kind of switch hands or go out of business. But more broadly, 100 years ago, cities like New York had many more residents than they do today. And they were far less dominated by offices than they are today. And not just dominated in terms of the buildings themselves, but actually today, when you look at a lot of our cities, the offices dictate almost everything else. They dictate the type of roads we have, the type of traffic infrastructure, the type of businesses that we have surrounded those employment areas. All of that stuff is kind of downstream from that assumption that people are going to be here every day from 9 to 5. And once you change that assumption, everything else has to kind of readjust. And under the best case, that means that our cities are going to become more mixed use, more residential, more kind of celebrating the kind of stuff that you can only do in a city. You need to live in a beautiful, walkable, diverse, fun, healthy place. And I think that the best cities are going to make that adjustment, but it's going to be painful no matter what. And it's going to take time as well. It's not going to happen over 2 years or even 10. It's going to take some time.
And do you think that is the long run implication of that just more equilibrium finding both nationally and globally? Meaning, like, do you see less spread in real estate prices for commercial real estate across markets, less spread in talent in terms of how much you pay people, less spread in housing? Like, how is that continue to happen, or do you still think there'll be significant difference in super dense, kind of like historically tier 1 cities like New York versus others, even with some of this kind of spreading of talent and spreading of where people work?
So I like to look at what happened to online media when I think about what's going to happen to locations. And what you saw with the internet as it emerged, people thought of this idea of the long tail, of like, the democratization of attention or of revenue for music or for video. Where instead of like a small number of superstars making money, now there's going to be a long tail of other people who are going to be smaller superstars. What actually happened is a bit more complicated. We got a long tail. There are more people today making money from music and from video and from content than before. But at the same time, the superstars have actually become bigger than ever and more dominant in terms of how much of the overall pie they eat. So, if you had like an 80-20 thing 20 years ago, today on Spotify, I think the top 0.5% of streams, I don't know, generate about 80% of the listens, which is much more skewed than in the world of record stores and kind of physical constraints. I think something similar will happen to locations. We'll have many more options to choose from, but we'll also have a handful of winners that are going to be bigger than ever. Not necessarily because of their importance as employment centers, but because of their employment as living centers. So again, a place like New York City, when you let everyone work wherever they want, probably on net, more people on Earth will want to live in New York City now than before, just because they can, especially if you build more housing for them. On the other hand, there might be some other cities that completely get crushed and eliminated. So both in the middle, but even among the top cities, not all of them are going to make it. You know, San Francisco is a candidate for that list. I'm not predicting that it's going to disappear, but you know, again, Manhattan, you want to live there even if you don't work there. Central San Francisco, I don't know, depends. So that's what I see happening. And on top of that, just kind of untethering of the job market from the kind of where people are. So at the moment you're hiring in New York, you're hiring in San Francisco, but you might get to a point where, you know, yeah, people live wherever they live and you hire them because you need them. And maybe you have a satellite office in a bunch of cities, but you don't have to decide as a company where you are officially, or even if you do decide, it doesn't really impact you as much as it did 5 or 10 years ago.
Yep. And I've already started to see some of that with hiring, I think on some sites by time zone, right? It's not even city specific necessarily, but as long as we can collaborate together at similar hours, that works. So, you know, Dror, maybe one final question for you before we get into the rapid fire, but in 2019, you wrote a book that in 2023 largely proved out to be pretty correct, right? And so if you were thinking about today, 4 years from now, are there any things that you strongly believe or predictions that we haven't talked about that maybe would be interesting to spend a moment on?
So it's all still playing out, everything from the previous book. I think inequality is an interesting question for me. So again, that kind of fraying of the middle class, the kind of application of the economics of superstars to all white collar professions, and even to some kind of in-person professions, like the Peloton instructor or the truck driver, things that we didn't think were possible to do remotely or digitally. We're suddenly seeing that kind of are subject to the same kind of dynamics. So where that is going is very interesting to me, and what we can do about it as a society in terms of kind of mitigating the effects of that, and while still keeping the prosperity that comes from that. So I think like inequality and innovation or prosperity seem to be inextractable probably in our kind of creative world that is dominated by these kind of network effects and non-linear outcomes. So that's very interesting. And I think there's a story now of cities and how they transform. I think, I said that at the heart of COVID, I think, Manhattan's population will be much larger in 10 years than it was 10 years before, which is a good thing. But the transition and how it's managed, I think, will be really, really interesting. Another thing is that overall demand for office might not diminish as much as we think, but it will just be redistributed. So maybe closer to people's homes, maybe in other types of cities, maybe even in other types of buildings. So that's interesting as well. It doesn't help people who own current buildings where they are, but it does give you a kind of more hope for the industry as a whole. And mostly just, I'm very focused on, what it means to us as people. Why are we even working? Why do we make the choices we make? Once you give us a bit more freedom in terms of where to live and how to live, what are we going to do with that freedom? So that's what I'm spending time on figuring out, both for myself and for my readers.
That's super interesting. And it's such a fundamental reimagining at this time of how do we think about work and the relationship spurred by trends. It sounds like that we're moving that way already before the pandemic, but certainly accelerated over the last few years. I think folks be very wise to listen to some of the things you're thinking about, given your track record on this topic. So I appreciate you sharing. One thing we always do, Dror, to finish up is rapid fire. We'll ask you just a number of quick questions just to have folks better understand who you are and what makes you tick, if that sounds okay to you.
Let's go.
All right. So what was your very first job?
Party promoter in middle school.
That's great. What is the best book you've read lately?
Oh, there are many. One book I read recently, it's not new, it's about 20 years old. It's called Linked. It's by Albert Laszlo Barabashi, who was like a physicist and a network scientist. And it's basically a book about network science, but how it applies to reality. And I think it has a lot of hints and insights about where we're headed. So once, cities are networks, employment markets are networks. And once you remove some of those physical constraints, they start to behave much more similarly to other kind of digital networks or even networks that exist in nature within cells or everywhere else. And there's some interesting insights there.
Oh, that's super interesting. I'll have to check that out. When you are in meetings with video conference, do you typically do video on or are you video off?
First, I have religiously avoid meetings to begin with. So that would be my answer. But if I'm in a meeting, I'm happy to have video because that at least keeps me focused, because otherwise I would just, start doing 5 other things while I'm on that meeting.
I totally understand. And this topic of meetings, by the way, is a whole other topic that I feel like has become a big one of recent. What show or movie are you obsessed with right now?
Oh, right now I'm waiting for the final episode of Succession. But generally my approach to TV in particular is just to watch The Sopranos again from the beginning whenever I feel like I have to watch something. So I'm happy to just survive on that.
When you are in your office, what is your favorite snack to eat?
Nuts, hazelnuts, pecan nuts.
Got it. And software that you use, what is your favorite piece of software for flexible work or kind of remote productivity?
Ooh, a recent favorite, I don't know if it's necessarily for remote productivity, but there's 11 Labs. It's like a voice generator that basically converts a lot of my articles into audio using my own voice without me having to read it. So it both saves me time. And also it just reads it much better than I would, but it still sounds like me. So even my mother wasn't sure. Oh, it worked.
High bar.
So
thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.
There's a lady called Nadia Asparuhova. She wrote a book called Working in Public, which was about the open source community and how they collaborate and different dynamics there, but also has a lot of lessons, particularly for where we are now in terms of people working remotely, collaborating asynchronously, the distribution of kind of effort and work compared to outcomes among different teams. A lot of interesting things. And she generally blogs about it every now and then. I think she's writing another book now about kind of like the emerging tech elite or something like that. So she's a wonderful writer and very thoughtful, because she's both an anthropologist / sociologist, but she doesn't come to it like most of people of that economic kind of breeding. They're like very kind of anti-business, very critical, very to the point of being uncurious about those sometimes incredible things that they're describing and recording. And she's like much more, at least agnostic or open-minded to those things. And she actually sees what's interesting about them more than what they tell you about, what the government should do or something else. So I really enjoy her work.
Very cool. And one final question for you. If the folks that are listening want to learn more about you or read more about the thinking that you're doing, where should they go?
So find me on Twitter at Dror Poleg, DRORPOLEG, or drorpoleg.com, or just Google Rethinking Real Estate, and then you'll find me. Maybe easier.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed this. It's fascinating to hear your insights. I'm excited to see over the next few years where some of the topics that you described go. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Rob. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.